So I'm very grateful to be here. I've been a fan of Egenis since nearly since it started. I'm going to do something that's unusual here, even unusual for me, which is that I'm going to talk about my work, but I'm going to celebrate interdisciplinarity in the Egenis form and John Dupre's work indirectly, in the sense that I never really learned to celebrate interdisciplinarity. I just had to figure out how to do it on the fly because I don't have any degrees in philosophy. My best known paper is in a sociology journal. And when I got hired at University of California, Davis, I was given a choice of going to a history department or a philosophy department. And it was almost a coin flip because it was a one-year job. And I ended up in philosophy. So I don't usually say I'm a philosopher. People call me that. I say that I do biology studies because it has a nice acronym. So what I'm going to do here is really just give you an overview of a research agenda that I've been pursuing for over 30 years now. And the reason it's making me uncomfortable is, well, two things. One, I always tell students not to make the presentation look shinier than the arguments that are in the presentation. So you're going to see a lot of chaos because I'm not going to give you an argument at all. What I'm doing instead is talking about things I don't understand, which include some of my own, the implications of my own work. What I'm trying to do here is to find my way to a different sort of methodology than I have been practicing thus far, because I don't understand where I've landed with the thinking that I've been developing. So I want to celebrate Egenis and the generosity and friendship of John Dupre, but also many other people here for welcoming a different way of working and a different way of thinking than is usually on offer, but also for myself. So several times over in the history of Egenis, I've been invited here to talk about very different kinds of projects at very different stages. And since research is a process, I'm displaying research at a very weird stage where I don't know what I'm doing. I thought I did, but I no longer do. So I decided I'm going to do this weird talk in an unusual way. I turned it into a one-slide talk, so it can be very short. This is an argument I developed pretty soon after Richard Dawkins published The Extended Phenotype in 1982. I was working on a project with Bill Wimsatt on how to picture the arguments of August Weismann about his development of the concept of germ and soma. And one thing that struck me in Dawkins's book was he said that all he's doing is extreme Weismannism. And that alerted me to a way of thinking that I then brought back to Dawkins's thinking, which was that I didn't like the concept of the replicator. Replication, fine, but the way Dawkins described it, persistence in the form of copies, seemed like a strange way to talk about that process of replication, partly because I didn't think copying was a very good way to understand what it is. So I came to the conclusion that the replicator was a pernicious concept because copying misfocuses genetic research on genes, attributing all genetic properties to sequences, so that in a way it misinterprets the causal roles of genes in genetic explanations. Now, why can I make this talk a one-slide talk? Because a couple of years ago, John and Sabina Leonelli wrote a very nice paper about process epistemology that distinguished two forms of reification in terms of means and in terms of targets. And so the whole talk could just be, I've landed in a strange place because I didn't like the copying account of replication. And everything I would like to say to conclude this as a kind of argument is simply that I just need to plug in the Dupre-Leonelli account of means and target reification to show why replicator is a terrible reification of replication. So, okay, I guess technically that means it's two talks. Thank you. That's the end of it. But I presume you were expecting something a bit more. And so what the rest of this will be is what that kind of argument that I couldn't give the, insofar as that's really an argument, I wouldn't be able to apply the kind of vocabulary and thinking that John and Sabina gave us in process epistemology. We didn't have that vocabulary in 1985, 6, 7, when I was thinking about Dawkins. So I didn't know how to put it in that kind of way. The way the argument unfolded has a 30-year history, because what I ended up doing with the replicator was substituting what I call the reproducer, and in reinterpreting that object reproducer as an invention out of reproduction as a process, I was doing the kinds of things that I now think of as Dupre adjacent. So John was down there in Stanford and then came over here, and I was doing many of the things that he was writing about, but I didn't adopt his language for it, but doing them nevertheless. And so I want to identify some of the turns in this BS work that I've been doing in terms of process thinking, shifting from objects to processes, both ontologies and epistemologies, shifting from the found objects that we muddy boots philosophers going out and stomping around amongst the biologists hear them talking about, toward how we've practiced finding these objects to talk about. And the sort of methodological shift I'm trying to take is to stop talking about what my mentor, Bill Wimsatt, always talked about, models and heuristics for modeling, to something that works better for me in thinking about how to think about processes that I want to trouble, to understand in a different way. And so I'm thinking in terms of navigating a landscape with simple tools to get around, but I don't know what to say about the journey I'm on yet. Another turn is one that I think is an echo of the kind of argument or way of working that Stefan was talking about this morning, about the role of history as a kind of philosophical pursuit. And then the last one that is something that I don't think I would have done, but for the kinds of pushes that folks here at Egenis have done in thinking about roles of values, particularly John, but also others on my side of the pond, as we say. And that's to think about values. But I want to think about them as in a sort of Wimsattian context, and that's why I'm calling them heuristic values, and thinking about them in the context that I'm following Wimsatt and calling thickety. So I'll explain what thickety is here. So the first turn, process ontology, what I was trying to do with Dawkins's replicator was to think about what objects we might construct out of process by thinking differently about the process. So I didn't like the copying process. I give this kind of imagery of a painting. A copy of the Mona Lisa that you make on a photocopying machine might be a kind of a slightly pixelated version that gets you the whole picture. A different kind of process of multiplying Mona Lisa is to tear the painting in half. And so it has an exact resemblance, you might say, in some respects and not others, each half to the original. It got me thinking about the material relationships between what we call parents and offspring in reproduction processes, and at least in biological reproduction. And it led me to a kind of a collection of concepts that afforded a kind of overturning for me, the framing we get in 20th century biology around a trio of very fundamental concepts. But this notion that there's an important material relations between the things we call parents and the things we call offspring, and how that isn't like tearing paintings in half. And that puts the focus on development, because what halves of paintings don't do is develop into the whole painting again. So it's that shift is something that Dawkins never reconciled to, and that is, where does development fit in that replicator vehicle picture? So putting development in was always on the table for me. And that's partly because one of the scientists I engaged with as an undergraduate was a biologist, David Wake, who was one of the earliest pioneers of what's now called Evo-Devo. The undergraduate text in my evolution class included both Richard Lewontin's 1974 book, but also the manuscript of Steve Gould's Ontogeny and Phylogeny, because they were in dialogue about that project. So figuring out where development fits in relation to what we usually think of as inheritance was part of what this project was about. Okay, so second turn was a kind of a process epistemology turn, and this is a different kind of orientation. There is actually a connection between this project and the Reproducer project, but I haven't worked it out in any sufficient way to actually talk to you about it. It's something that Mary Morgan and Sabina Leonelli pulled me into initially in the Mary's project of studying traveling facts, but then Sabina invited me to participate in her project on data journeys. And this is a shift from thinking about the production of data as objects to what we call the re-situation of data from one context to another. So a data journey involves something like travel that changes the character of the data, even if it's just the context of the data set in which they are situated. And this has led me to a whole series of thoughts about the materiality of these resituations of data, and it's that material connection that will, I hope, eventually lead me back to thinking about reproduction as a kind of process that transcends the biological. Just an example of how data move. This is from the project that tried to track gene sequences and how data transformations end up moving not just around a piece of software, but also between laboratories as it gets uploaded and downloaded and reconfigured. And these movements are very much of a piece with the kind of tracking that I wanted to do in thinking about what I like and don't like about the metaphors we use to talk about biological reproduction, like copying. Third turn, a kind of practice turn in the philosophy of science, and this is the one that is the most central to the kind of methodological shift I'm trying to make to understand where to take this project on the concept of reproduction. And that's to pull away from worrying about whether what I'm offering in understanding reproduction a different way than Dawkins understood replication was representational, building a model, or in the way philosophers sometimes talk about it, analyzing a concept. I'm not analyzing the concept of reproduction. I'm not making a representation of how reproduction in models, I would say models of inheritance work. I'm trying to build a conceptual compass to navigate a landscape where we don't even know how to look for reproduction phenomena. This way of thinking started when Peter Godfrey Smith wrote in his 2009 book that my view of reproduction couldn't be right because there are lots of cases of reproduction that don't involve this material relationship between parents and offspring. Reproduction can be purely informational. And my reflection on Dawkins's copying metaphor was, how does the photocopy machine make the copy? And where's the materiality of that machinery for copy making in the replication process? You can ask the same question about the role of the other cellular components involved in the replication process. It led off into all sorts of interesting side issue weirdness, like where is the genetic code? Do nucleic acids carry codes? No, the genetic code is a collection of enzymes that do the translation work. So the set of roughly 20 amino-acyl tRNA synthetase enzymes are the code. If there's no material overlap between parent cell and offspring, you just don't have a code in them. In fact, that's how thus code was worked out, was by lethality mutations that knocked out a synthetase, so you missed out on a particular amino acid incorporated into any sequence that got translated. So this materiality constraint seems to me quite important, but I don't really know what to do with it in tracing out the consequences of this kind of developmentalized view of reproduction that I've been building. And all day today, I've been worrying about the kinds of arguments that we were hearing this morning. Does the story that Paul Griffiths was giving about sex work the same way if you think about reproduction my way? Because one of the implications of my view of reproduction is, just had this conversation with Ford about the molecular level. Do strands of DNA reproduce? Well, yes, if you recognize that a single-stranded piece of DNA has to form a duplex in order to make a so-called copy, but then you have 3 stages in the life cycle there: a single strand, a double strand, a single strand, material overlap from the single strand to the double-stranded state, the double-stranded state to the single-stranded state, therefore material overlap all the way along. It's transitive. But if you think that the replication, the copy making is from single strand to single strand, there's no material connection between the so-called parent and the so-called offspring. So so I land in a strange place in thinking, well, the genetic code is actually about enzymes, not about nucleic acids. That's a good idea if you're worried about whether the origin of life could have come from single-stranded mRNA or RNAs that do everything, or whether you think the origin of life was a phenomenon of the invention of metabolism in membrane-bounded structures. So what I'm saying is, I've kind of lost my grip on the phenomena while I've tried to make a conceptual reform. And now I want to use the concepts, even though they're not good representations of the way most people talk about biology. So what do I do with that? Well, I'm thinking it's a compass. And I'm wandering off into landscapes that I don't know how to navigate otherwise than just trusting the compass to take me someplace, and then to look around once I get there. I'm not worried about that because I was trained in the woods by a wild animal of a philosopher, Bill Wimsatt. And we're used to this kind of muddy boots engineering or re-engineering philosophy, as he calls it. So what do we do with rethinking when what we're trying to do is navigate a landscape? So I figured I better put, a landscape picture in here so that you have something pleasant to look at while I say all the rest of the pictures that I'm going to show of my landscapes are just a mess at the moment. But they're echoes of things that we've been hearing for 2 days now. So I have some hope that I'll be able to get around to doing something good with it. Notice that in this picture, it's not that hard to pick out the elements of the picture, and there are all kinds of ways we can talk about how these elements grouped together give us a way of understanding what's going on in the picture, and that's what I'm looking for when I look for reproductive phenomena. So one of the strange features of the landscape I'm in is development turns out not to be an exclusive matter of what organisms do. So it's not autopoietic, it's sympoietic. What are the elements of the collaborative poiesis of an organism in its development? Well, it's normally what we call ecology. So I've had to tinker with the basic metaphors as I've tried to refigure core concepts. I mentioned Weismann's German Soma. I don't think of German Soma the way, say, John Maynard Smith did, which was my introduction to John Dupre, was his wonderful conference, The Latest on the Best. That's the book that came out of it. John Maynard Smith had a completely Weismannist reading of units of evolution based on the germ-soma distinction. And now I've gone back to look at Weismann and see Weismann as a developmentalist. The germ is part of the soma. It can't be otherwise. And I went on from that sort of upside down view of germ and soma to upside down views or inside out views of the other parts of my triad of concepts to upset. One is Mendel's factor-character distinction. What was Mendel doing? He was a developmentalist. The gene, what we call the gene, what Mendel called factors, are things that I now think of as developmental invariants, and that Mendel's laws are a theory of invariance for biology. There are things that don't change in the development of the organism, and that Mendel's laws are really about a form of developmental invariance. The third of my trio of classical notions that I turned over was Johansson's genotype-phenotype distinction, And I went back to one of Johansson's earlier framings of the genotype-phenotype distinction, that the genotype is the phenotype of a pure line. That has led me to rethinking a lot of the rest of 20th century biological concepts, which is why I'm in a complete mess about this. You're still looking at the landscape picture. Here's a mess. Waddington's epigenetic landscape. I had to add the environment as pegs pulling the stretching the landscape, as well as gene pegs, which are Waddington's, pulling it from underneath, to understand this kind of developmentalist picture that I had emerging. I had to change my mind about what a norm of reaction diagram could be, because a developmental norm of reaction is something that changes the shape of the reaction itself, because development isn't just about what goes on in the inside. It's about what goes on in the environment that changes the trajectory of a developmental life history. It's what makes me now have to, in light of Paul's talk, have to rethink what sex is, because those life histories look different to me now. I won't tell you any more about this. I have actually published arguments like on this kind of stuff, but it no longer makes any sense to me. So what have I been doing? Well, in a way, I've been refiguring the narratives that biologists tell about the history of their concepts. The reproducer idea led me back to 19th and 20th century understandings of properties that we call heredity, heritability, and inheritance. And now I want to map them to regions of biology that have this way of re-emerging every time some new thing comes along. So I developed the argument about reproducing in the 1980s and early 1990s. The epigenetics revolution emerged in the 1990s, and suddenly I had a new unit of inheritance I had to worry about. Alongside that, evolutionary transition thinking, the origination of new levels of organization. Maynard Smith and Sothmary used a replicator concept to build their original transition idea, but I plugged a reproducer concept in there with the critique that, on their view, there could only ever be a single transition, because it can't be, they're not all changes in the way replication happens, which is how they characterize transition, but there could be lots of transitions if it's a change in the way reproduction happens. So my refiguring of these core concepts has led me to think completely differently about what am I doing when I'm doing this historical refiguring work, and what I'm doing when I'm trying to figure out how does this materiality of reproduction, which is a real turn away from informational thinking, lead me to find new phenomena to talk about. So I'm turning to different ways of describing what I'm doing. I'm tracking the phenomena that the scientists talk about in different ways, because my compass points me in different kinds of directions. Just skip that. So the last turn is in thinking about nature and science together as a thickety phenomenon. And what I mean about that is just putting the resources on the table here, and I'll show you a picture from Wimsatt in just a second. Thinking about ontology and epistemology is not separate things. And the reason for that is roughly that levels of organization, as Wimsatt talked about, it is something that we can sort, where we can have an ontological view of the things or processes at a level. The epistemology of science involves describing the things or processes at at levels. When things get complicated, as Kaufman argued in the 1970s, we can offer different adequate descriptions of those very same phenomena. But for very complex phenomena, those perspectives don't easily map to the levels. They become kind of an ontological problem in their own right. And then what Wimsatt observed was that the very most complicated phenomena that we might call social, cultural, biological, chemical, and physical all together, the descriptions are so complicatedly entangled with the ontologies that are required from the different perspectives that they're completely entangled, that we don't know how to trace with a single coherent ontology through the descriptions. Lately, I've been trying to think about that in terms of what Lisa Lloyd calls a logic of research questions, to think about the ways biologists grappling with complex phenomena have shaped the research agendas and the sequencing of answers to questions for doing that kind of work. Here's the picture from Wimsatt about how you get from neat levels of organization. So the nodes here are supposed to be different levels. When the levels break down, we have to shift to multiple perspectives. When the perspectives break down, we shift to this thickety description where we're jumping back and forth between ontological and epistemic modes of account of what we're trying to understand. I've lately also had to add some thinking that I'm now drawing from Stuart Kauffman about what he calls the adjacent possible, because the way I want to think about the overturning of these classical ideas that pulls the environment into the picture of what reproduction of the organism looks like, what I call scaffolded development, can be understood in terms of models of how you scaffold your way into a completely novel scenario where the models of evolution don't actually work. So this is what Kauffman calls evolution into the adjacent possible, which he thinks is unprestatable. It's a way of describing evolution where the state space and the phase space of evolution cannot be described for what happens. I think there may be a way to model that, and this picture on the lower right is an attempt by some physicists to actually model that. But I don't like what they do with this polya urn model, because the urn is this magical place where the environment can change without any explanation. So what I want to turn to is something like a thickety view of the way we bring value both to our philosophical practices, but I hope this can be turned inside out to a kind of pluralistic, or what I prefer to call multi-perspectival view of thickety descriptions of techno-science or science, society, culture altogether. What I have in mind by this is that we have to be able to endorse alternative ontologies all in the same space. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of requiring all of them together to deal with nature, science, and the understanding of science all together, where no single choice of an ontology can be the best all-purpose one for any particular description, because we can't rely on a single description. We have to rely on as Wimsatt would put it, cross-cutting descriptions of cross-cutting causal processes that we nevertheless have to navigate to reach some kind of understanding. So I'm left in an onto-epistemic normative thicket where all I can do is take my little compass and wander off into the woods and wonder about these phenomena. I hope at the end of the day that I would be able to draw some conclusions, but I'm not going to draw any today. I don't owe you any conclusions because I didn't make an argument to make a conclusion about. I'm simply trying to paint a picture of a landscape, and all I've done here is not really something Bruegel-esque. I've just said, okay, let's make a picture. It's got some hunters in it. There's an ice rink, and it's winter. Put some trees somewhere. I think I have all the pieces I need to do that by now, but I haven't painted the picture. What I don't want to do, and this is where I'm now stuck between Philip and John in the way Philip was requesting a pullback around the realism. I don't want to claim that my picture is better than yours because I think we live in a thickety world, and the only way we're going to achieve robustness of perspective is to find a way to collaborate across these ontological divides, epistemic divides. So I'm not going to claim my picture is better than anyone else's because I have no idea even how to bring mine into relation. And that's partly why I've been lagging in trying to map my process thinking with John's. So I think all I can hope is that I can display the landscape and say that probably my picture will end up depending on your picture as much as it does on my own. So I invite the conversation. Thank you.
We have given